So my presentation today is on remediation projects and using mitigation banks to help achieve the goals of remediation projects. I know a lot of people in this room work on remediation projects that are basically hazardous waste cleanups. I know Arcadis, Weston, URS work on remediation projects quite often. And if you can see these images on the cover, the image on the left-hand side is actually a degraded wetland on an industrial site that's going to be subjected to corrective actions, basically capping for a hazardous waste issue. Whereas on the right-hand side is a restored seasonal wetland in a nearby mitigation bank. So I don't know if it's clear, but there's just a divergence in the difference between the habitat quality in both those types of habitats. And hazardous waste cleanups, when they interface with wetland habitats, they're typically permitted under a nationwide permit. Nationwide permit number 38 allows for the cleanup and the stabilization of waste. When we looked at the Army Corps' ORMS database, that's basically their permit tracking database, there's about 3 nationwide permit 38s issued in the San Francisco district each year. In California, there's about 5 issued each year, and throughout the country, there's about 52. So there are a fair amount of hazardous waste projects that interface with wetlands quite often. The other type of permit or project that can interface with wetlands is a Superfund site or a CERCLA cleanup, and those are not necessarily tracked in the Army Corps' database, so there may be more. Under CERCLA, there's no Section 404 permit required, even if you're interfacing with wetlands. And instead of the Army Corps taking the role in that, usually the EPA takes the role in that. And although an Army Corps permit's not required, the EPA mandates that the Section 404 has to be, the requirements have to be met, and there's these executive orders that also have to be met that basically mimic the requirements of Section 404. In the 2008 rule, there's also the ability for mitigation banks to meet the requirements of other programs, not just Section 404. You can meet civil works projects or Department of Defense projects, and also CERCLA, or Superfund cleanups. They specifically reference the executive orders that are defined in the, or mentioned in the CERCLA requirements. Also, the California specific bank templates reference 13 different federal policies and 9 different state regulations or policies. And it depends on your specific bank. If you have state signatories like the regional board or the Department of Fish and Game sign on to your bank, then you can meet those various state ones. When you also with the feds, you can meet the Army Corps, the EPA, Fish and Wildlife Service, and the National Marine Fisheries Service. You can essentially meet all those federal policies and mandates. So looking at the distribution of potentially hazardous waste sites, I looked at the State Water Quality Control Board's EnviroStore database. And this is just in the South Bay. Each little dot is either a Superfund site, which are the red ones, I don't know if you can see it on there, or state response sites where the DTSC is involved. There's also purple ones which are subject to corrective actions, currently undergoing cleanup or have some ongoing cleanups that are required. As we move farther north along the bay, you can see that there's still a fair amount. Around Hunters Point is actually a CERCLA site. There's a fair amount in the East Bay. Not too many in Marin or the North Bay. As you get over into the kind of San Pablo Bay on the east side, there's more. And then, so this is the Contra Costa County shoreline where there's a lot of industrial sites, so you can see a fair amount there. So this is the distribution of CERCLA sites, Superfund sites, very contaminated sites across the country. You can see California has its fair amount, San Francisco Bay Area has a fair amount, not as many as my home state of New Jersey, which is riddled. So some of the considerations with the remediation projects that allow mitigation banks to help it is that there are time considerations. Most of these cleanups you want to be implemented quickly. You don't want to, let these sit for years during a cleanup. Also, a lot of them, to figure out how to close the unit properly, you need to do exploratory trenching, soil borings, get access to those sites, and those actually interface with wetlands quite often, as opposed to also the ultimate closure. The restoration of those temporary impacts may not be feasible because you're just going to go in there again and ultimately close a unit, or it's the aquatic habitats are actually on a contaminated unit, so it doesn't make sense to restore them on a contaminated area. Usually a lot of the closure solutions require a permanent cap, and that they require, you're not allowed to have percolation into the aquifer, so it's basically an impervious cap on top. There's also future long-term maintenance requirements of the cap itself and of the perimeter, so that to do restoration on the site or on the perimeter really doesn't make sense. And they're usually on industrial areas, highly impacted wetlands, and it's very difficult to restore habitat on such an area. And then also to do permanent responsible mitigation on an industrial site that has really a paucity of available land, chemical concerns, and long-term monitoring requirements of the perimeter that require consistent access to those areas could disturb any restored area along the periphery. So these are some pictures of some wetlands in the Bay Area that are subject to some corrective actions. Not the greatest quality, but they do meet the definition of wetlands. The one on the top left is Hunter's Point. I think the one on the bottom right is the Alameda Point Naval Yard. What I did is I looked through a study to evaluate the effectiveness of doing permanent responsible on hazardous waste sites. There was a study that was funded by the state board through UCLA and USF. Dr. Richard Ambrose and John Calloway evaluated, I think it was about 143 mitigation sites throughout California. They performed CRAM functional assessments, and then they evaluated the performance compliance of both the 401 permit conditions and the mitigation plan. And what I did is I looked at as many sites that were analogous or directly related to a hazardous waste cleanup. So either an oil refinery cleanup, a landfill cleanup, or just a hazardous waste cleanup. So there's about 5 examples in the 143 files. And this is a landfill in Stockton. And so what that top row is the evaluation criteria. The most important ones are the percent acreage met, the CRAM, the 401, and the mitigation plan. So this mitigation site was constructed adjacent to the landfill. They didn't meet their acreage requirement. It was about 85.6. The CRAM score was 53.82. So the higher the CRAM score, the higher percentage, the better value. There's a variety of metrics that go into a CRAM score. 53 is not that good. When you look at the 401 compliance, NA either meant that there was no specific requirements in the permit itself, and the mitigation plan maybe not the same, was not written that great. It was certified in 1996, so it's an older project, so maybe did not have a lot of detail. So you can see some of the second bullet point. It was actually because it was constructed next to the landfill. It had a clay liner, and it didn't have a natural substrate. It was a compacted clay liner. And there was road crossings across the mitigation area to allow access to the landfill. So not a high quality mitigation site. There's another one in Crescent City, Del Norte County, so farther north. So this one did meet it exceeded its mitigation acreage. The CRAM score was much higher. It was about 86, and it met all of its 401 requirements and most of its mitigation plan requirements. This was also adjacent to the landfill, but is actually incorporated into an adjacent wildlife management area. It was also designed more naturally, didn't have compacted clay layers or anything related to that. Also, it's in Delaware County. The climate is more temperate as opposed to arid, so the hydrology allowed it to become, more functioning wetland. And they actually, because it was incorporated into a wildlife management area, it actually had a special status frog colonize the mitigation site. This is a more local mitigation site, the Potrero Hills landfill, and it was certified in 1997. The mitigation site was created adjacent to the landfill, didn't meet all its mitigation acreage, but you can see this cram score was very, very low, and it didn't meet all of its 401 or mitigation plan requirements. It was comprised of both tidal and seasonal wetland habitat, and they scored pretty low for the physical and the biotic structure requirements or criteria under CRAM. But the hydrology wasn't that great, and there was also some development that bisected the mitigation sites. This is a Air Force Base remediation down in Riverside County. It's also an older one, certified in '95. It exceeded its mitigation acreage, but the only reason it met that exceeded the mitigation acreage is if you look to the bottom bullet, they actually didn't meet it originally, and they had to go back in and create additional ones several years later because the original one failed. And the original one was also not a creation. It was actually a mitigation for a temporary impact where they restored the site. And you can see the CRAM score is 70, which is it's not great, but it's not poor. It's passing essentially. This is a mitigation site that was in an industrial refinery in Southern California. It was relatively recent, certified 2000. It exceeded its acreage exorbitantly, had a really low CRAM score, and didn't meet nearly most of its 401 requirements. And what this was riparian habitat. It wasn't wetland habitat. It was like 1602 riparian habitat, and it was located within the refinery and adjacent to an existing road. And the road essentially isolated the feature from its watershed. And because it was in a refinery, interviews with the people that owned the refinery indicated that it caught fire several times and really destroyed the habitat. So it's not a great place to put a mitigation wetland. But there are some examples of mitigation sites conducted in hazardous waste areas that have been successful. One of the more local one is on Mare Island. It was a circle site. It's implemented for a Navy cleanup. I believe this is called Area H1, where you can see the top left is an area before restoration. You can kind of see these areas of uplands, and then you can kind of see in this bottom area where they connected these two areas, you can kind of see the excavations going on here where they connected areas of pickleweed, because this was not only for harvest or for wetlands, but also for harvest mouse, salt marsh harvest mouse. And I think they're about 4 years in, and it's meeting all of its performance criteria. It's about 82.5% of salt marsh cover. The year 4 performance criteria was 65%, and pickleweed covers at 45.5%. So this was done on a relatively large installation, so it wasn't done in the actual circle site. It was done nearby, but there was room nearby, and it was adjacent to some grid open space next to the San Francisco Bay margin. Another one that we've implemented recently is at Hunters Point. It's not actually within a circle site, and it's not a cleanup, but it was a restoration done on a contaminated site. And this is a before picture where you can see these areas are completely uplands, and this is what Max was referring to before, where you create wetlands from uplands. And so this is a tidal channel in San Francisco, in the Hunters Point area, And then what we did is we excavated these basins and created, this is taken at high tide, so it's fully flooded right now. And so this is only the first year. It's only been about a little over a year since we've done this. But you can see it's possible. But what I'd like to say about this site, and then maybe either Len from Wesley could speak more about the H1, is that this project, because it was done on contaminated areas, was highly challenging from a physical location and from a biological, hydrological perspective, and also chemical. It became so expensive to do this project, and it was a restoration project done on state parks land. So we really made every effort to really make this successful. And if somebody was to do a project like this as permanently responsible, it would cost more than any credit that you could buy in the Bay Area. It was a very challenging project. This was done in an industrial area. Also, Hunters Point area, there was an on-site nursery that got vandalized and added additional costs to the project. So it was just very, very challenging. And so I think the remediation projects, because they go, there's several that go on each year. You don't want to, necessarily create wetlands on contaminated sites. It seems like a poster child for buying credits and allowing these projects to move forward faster. So right now, in the Bay Area, ones that drain to the bay, there's 4 existing mitigation banks. There's Max's Bank down in the South Bay, which is tidal, San Francisco Bay Mitigation Bank. There's the Burdell Bank in Marin County, which I think it may be sold out now. It has 1 or 2 credits left. There's the North Sassoon Bank in Solano County, and there's also the L.C. Gridley Bank in Solano County. So this one may be gone. These also, I know there's a lot of big projects going on there now. These may have a lot of their credits taken up shortly. So hopefully, I know there's a couple mitigation banks in the pipeline coming up. So hopefully in the future, those types of projects will be able to utilize them more and move those projects forward quickly. That's it. Any questions?